there are some words spoken in total darkness that carry more weight than anything ever written in books. Words that come from a place so deep inside a man that when they leave his mouth, the air around him changes. The kind of words that are not planned, not practiced, not said for anyone to hear except the one person standing close enough to feel the trembling in the voice. In a frozen night on the edge of the Oregon wilderness, sometime during the bitter winter months of 1872, a young man dropped to his knees in front of a Modoc hunter and said something that would be carried through generations like fire passed from one torch to another. He said, "Hide my sister if they come." And the hunter, a man whose face had been carved by wind and war and loss, looked at him without any rush and said, "They won't reach you." That sentence did not come from arrogance. It came from something far more dangerous. It came from certainty. And in the world those men lived in, certainty was the only weapon that never ran out of ammunition. This is not a story from a history book. This is a story that lived inside the bones of people who walked through fire and kept walking. And if you stay long enough to hear it all, you will understand why some people are never truly defeated, even when the whole world stands against them. The land that stretched between the southern tip of Oregon and the northern edge of California was not just land. It was alive. The Modoc people had lived on that land for thousands of years, long before anyone with a different language or a different flag had ever set foot on it. They knew every rock, every stream, every cave, free a ridge. They knew which plants could heal a wound and which ones could stop a heart. They knew where the deer moved in the early morning and where the eagles rested when the sky turned orange in the evening. The land was not something they owned. It was something they belonged to. And for centuries, that was enough. There was no need for paper or borders or signatures. The earth knew who its children were. Among these people, there was a man who would later be known to the outside world by a name that was not his own. The settlers and soldiers would call him Captain Jack. But his real name, the name given to him by his own people, was Kinpuash. He was not born into a family of chiefs in the way that European kings were born into thrones. Leadership among the Modoc was earned, not inherited. A man had to prove himself through wisdom, through courage, through the ability to keep his people safe and fed and united. Kinpuash had all of those things. But he also had something else that made him different from many leaders before him. He had the ability to understand the minds of the people who were trying to destroy his world. He studied them. He watched how they moved, how they spoke, how they made promises, and then broke them like dry sticks underfoot. He did not hate them blindly. He understood them clearly. And that understanding made him far more dangerous than any man swinging a weapon in anger. The trouble had been building for years before it finally broke open. White settlers had been moving into Modoc territory since the 1840s. They came with wagons and cattle and dreams of land that they believed was empty. But the land was not empty. The Modoc were there. And as more settlers arrived, the clashes became more frequent and more violent. There were killings on both sides. Settlers ambushed Modoc families. Modoc warriors fought back. The cycle of blood continued, each act of violence feeding the next one like logs thrown onto a fire that nobody wanted to put out. In 1864, the United States government decided to solve the problem the way it always did. The Modoc, along with the Klamath and the Yahooskin band of Snake Indians, were told to move to the Klamath Reservation in southern Oregon. The land they were being sent to was not their land. It belonged to the Klamath people, who did not welcome the Modoc with open arms. In fact, the Klamath treated the Modoc with hostility. They bullied them, insulted them, took the better portions of food and supplies, and made it clear that the Modoc were unwanted guests in someone else's home. The reservation was a place of hunger and humiliation, and for a people who had once roamed freely across a vast and beautiful territory, it was like being locked inside a cage made of shame. Kinpuash tried to make it work. He truly did. He went to the reservation, followed the rules, sat in meetings with government agents and asked politely for better conditions. He asked for his people to be given their own separate piece of land, away from the Klamath, so they could live in peace without the constant fighting and disrespect. His requests were ignored. Every time he spoke, the agents nodded and wrote things down, and then did nothing. The promises floated away like smoke from a dying campfire. After 2 years of suffering on the Klamath Reservation, Kinpuash made a decision that would change everything. He gathered his people, about 200 men, women, and children, and he led them home. They walked back to their ancestral lands near Tule Lake, and they settled there, determined to live the way they had always lived. The government did not like this. A group of native people leaving a reservation without permission was considered an act of rebellion. Soldiers were sent to bring them back. Agents were sent to negotiate. Kinposh met with them and explained his reasons calmly. He told them that his people could not survive on the Klamath Reservation. He told them that they needed their own land, their own space, their own dignity. He was not asking for war. He was asking for fairness. But fairness was a word that the government used only when it suited them, and in this case, it did not suit them at all. For several years, there was an uneasy peace. The Modoc lived near Tule Lake, and the government mostly left them alone, not because they respected their rights, but because they had other problems to deal with. But by 1872, the pressure from local settlers had become too great. The settlers wanted the Modoc gone. They wanted the land. They wanted the water. They wanted everything that the Modoc called home. And so the government finally decided to act. On November 29, 1872, a detachment of soldiers under the command of Captain James Jackson rode into the Modoc camp near the Lost River with orders to bring Kinposh and his people back to the Klamath Reservation by force. The morning was cold. The sky was heavy with clouds that looked like bruises. Jackson and his men arrived at the camp and demanded that the Modoc surrender their weapons. For a moment, the world held its breath. Kinposh looked at the soldiers, and the soldiers looked at the Modoc warriors, and everyone knew that the next few seconds would decide whether blood would be spilled. A Modoc warrior named Scarface Charlie stood near Kinposh with a rifle in his hands. He was not a man who frightened easily. He had scars on his body that told stories of battles fought and survived. When a soldier approached him and demanded his weapon, Scarface Charlie did not move. The soldier reached for the rifle. A struggle began. And then a shot rang out. Nobody knew for certain who fired first, but it did not matter. The sound of that single gunshot was like a match dropped into a barrel of gunpowder. Within seconds, both sides were firing. The Battle of Lost River had begun. The fighting was chaotic and brutal. Bullets flew in every direction. Women screamed. Children, cried horses, panicked and bolted. Through the smoke and the noise, Kinposh kept his head. He shouted orders to his warriors, telling them to cover the women and children, telling them to fall back toward the lava beds to the south. The lava beds. That was the place. That was where they would make their stand. Because Kinposh knew something that the soldiers did not. He knew that land better than he knew his own hands. And he knew that the lava beds were a fortress that nature itself had built over thousands of years. The Modoc retreated south. They moved quickly but carefully, carrying their children, helping their elders, dragging what supplies they could. Behind them, the soldiers pursued, but the rough terrain slowed them down. The Modoc knew every trail, every shortcut, every hidden path through the rocks. By the time the soldiers realized where the Modoc were heading, it was already too late. Kinposh and his people had disappeared into the lava beds like ghosts vanishing into stone. The lava beds were a landscape unlike anything the soldiers had ever seen. Thousands of years of volcanic activity had created a maze of sharp black rock, deep caves, narrow tunnels, and towering formations that twisted and turned in every direction. The ground was uneven, covered with cracks and holes that could swallow a man's leg up to the knee. Visibility was limited. Sound echoed strangely off the rock walls, making it impossible to tell where a voice or a gunshot was coming from. For the Modoc, this place was home. They had played in these caves as children. They had hunted in these formations as young men. They knew every shadow, every crevice, every hiding place. To the soldiers, it was a nightmare. Kinposh established his stronghold in a section of the lava beds that would later be called Captain Jack's Stronghold. It was a natural fortress, protected on all sides by walls of jagged rock. There were caves for shelter, natural trenches for defense, and sight lines that allowed the Modoc to see anyone approaching from hundreds of yards away. With fewer than 60 warriors, Kinposh prepared to defend his people against the entire United States Army. It was madness by any logical measure. But logic had never been the language of the Modoc. Their language was survival. While the warriors prepared their defenses, the women and children settled into the caves. It was cold. The wind came through the rocks like a knife made of ice. Food was limited. Water had to be carried from sources that were dangerously exposed to enemy fire. But nobody complained. The Modoc had survived worse. They had survived centuries of challenges that would have broken lesser people. They built small fires deep inside the caves where the smoke could not be seen. They wrapped their children in blankets made of animal skins. They told stories to keep the fear away, and in the darkness of those caves, with the sound of the wind howling through the rocks, a young Modoc man approached one of the hunters and spoke the words that would echo through time. The young man's name has been lost to history, swallowed up by the chaos and the tragedy that followed, but the moment itself was remembered. He came to the hunter with his sister beside him. She was young, maybe 12 or 13 years old, with wide eyes that reflected the firelight like two small moons. The young man was shaking, not from the cold but from something deeper. He knew what was coming. He knew that the soldiers would attack. He knew that the odds were against them. And he knew that if the defenses failed, it would be the women and children who would suffer the most. He knelt in front of the hunter, a man who was known among the Modoc for his calm and his skill, a man who could track a deer through a snowstorm and bring it down with a single arrow, a man who had never been seen panicking, never been heard raising his voice in fear, never been known to break a promise. The young man looked up at him and said, "I'd my sister if they come." His voice cracked on the last word. It was not a request between equals. It was a plea from a brother who loved his sister more than he loved his own life. It was the sound of a young man accepting that he might die and wanting to make sure that the one person he cared about most would live. The hunter looked down at him. He did not rush to answer. He did not offer empty comfort or hollow promises. He studied the young man's face the way he studied tracks in the mud, reading every line, every shadow, every unspoken word. Then he looked at the girl. She stood still, her small hands clutching the edge of her blanket, her eyes fixed on her brother's face. The hunter placed his hand on the young man's shoulder, and he said, with a voice as steady as the rock beneath their feet, "They won't reach you." It was a statement of fact spoken by a man who had already decided how this would end. Not with surrender, not with retreat, but with a fight so fierce and so relentless that no soldier would ever set foot inside those caves. The young man looked into the hunter's eyes and saw something there that went beyond courage. He saw resolve. The kind of resolve that is not learned but forged, hammered out on the anvil of a lifetime of hardship and resistance. The night passed slowly. The fires burned low. The children slept in clusters, their small bodies pressed together for warmth. The warriors sat at their positions along the rock walls, their weapons ready, their eyes watching the darkness beyond the lava formations. Kintpuash moved among them quietly, checking their positions, speaking to them in low tones, reminding them what they were fighting for. He did not give grand speeches. He did not need to. Every man and woman in that stronghold knew exactly what was at stake. This was not about glory or honor or revenge. This was about survival. This was about the right to exist on the land that had given them life. As the first light of dawn began to paint the eastern sky in shades of grey and pale gold, the Modoc could see movement in the distance. The soldiers were assembling. There were hundreds of them, well armed, well supplied, well rested. They moved across the flat ground toward the lava beds with the confidence of men who believed that victory was inevitable. They had cannons. They had howitzers. They had repeating rifles and unlimited ammunition. Against them stood fewer than 60 Modoc warriors armed with old rifles, a limited supply of bullets, and the knowledge of every rock and shadow in the land they called home. The first battle was about to begin, and it would shock the entire nation. The morning of January 17, 1873, arrived with a silence that felt unnatural, the kind of silence that settles over a place just before something terrible happens. The sky was overcast, thick with clouds that hung low over the lava beds like a funeral cloth draped across the land. The air smelled of wet rock and frozen earth. From inside the stronghold, the Modoc warriors could see the long blue lines of soldiers forming on the open ground to the north and south. There were over 400 of them, regular army troops, volunteers from local settlements, and a scattering of scouts who had been hired to lead the way through the treacherous terrain. Against this force, Kintpuash had 52 warriors, 52 men standing between annihilation and everything they loved. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Wheaton commanded the assault. He was a career military officer who had fought in the Civil War and considered this operation a simple matter of overwhelming force. His plan was straightforward. 2 columns of soldiers would advance from opposite directions, north and south, squeezing the Modoc in a pincer movement that would leave them no room to escape. Artillery would soften the defenses first, pounding the lava formations with explosive shells until the Modoc were either dead or too shaken to fight. Then the infantry would move in and finish the job. On paper, It was a textbook operation. In reality, it was a catastrophe waiting to happen. The artillery opened fire at dawn. The sound of the howitzers echoed across the lava beds like thunder trapped inside a canyon. Shells exploded against the rock formations, sending showers of razor-sharp fragments into the air. The ground shook. Dust and smoke rose in thick columns that blotted out the weak winter sunlight. Inside the stronghold, the Modoc pressed themselves flat against the rock walls and waited. The shells were terrifying, but the lava beds absorbed much of the impact. The caves provided shelter. The natural trenches kept the warriors below the line of fire. Kint Pash had positioned his people perfectly. Every warrior was hidden behind rock cover that had been selected for maximum protection. The shells screamed overhead and exploded around them, but the casualties were remarkably few. When the artillery barrage finally ended, the infantry began their advance. The soldiers moved forward in disciplined lines, their boots crunching on the rough volcanic rock. They had been told that the Modoc were a small band of poorly armed savages who would scatter at the first sign of real military force. They expected the stronghold to be in ruins after the bombardment. They expected to find bodies and debris and the smell of defeat. What they found instead was silence. The silence lasted only a few seconds. Then the lava beds came alive with gunfire. The Modoc warriors fired from positions that were nearly invisible. They shot from behind rocks, from inside narrow crevices, from beneath overhanging ledges that concealed them completely. Their marksmanship was extraordinary. Almost every shot found a target. Soldiers fell in the front ranks, and the men behind them stumbled over the bodies. The officers shouted orders, but the echoing rocks made it impossible to tell where the commands were coming from. Confusion spread through the advancing columns like a disease. The soldiers fired back wildly, aiming at shadows and smoke, wasting ammunition on empty rock formations while the Modoc shifted from position to position like water flowing through cracks in stone. The terrain was the soldiers' greatest enemy. The lava beds were a nightmare landscape of jagged edges, hidden holes, and unstable surfaces. Men twisted their ankles in cracks. They cut their hands on the sharp rock when they fell. They could not maintain formation because the ground would not allow it. Units became separated. Squads lost contact with their officers. Individual soldiers found themselves alone in a maze of black rock with gunfire coming from directions they could not identify. Some of them simply stopped moving and pressed themselves against whatever cover they could find, too disoriented and too frightened to continue. Scarface Charlie led a group of warriors on the northern side of the stronghold. He moved through the rocks with a speed and certainty that bordered on supernatural. He seemed to know exactly where every soldier was, exactly when they would show themselves, exactly where to aim. His rifle cracked with a steady rhythm, and each shot was followed by the cry of another soldier going down. The warriors with him followed his lead, popping up from behind cover just long enough to fire, and then disappearing again before the soldiers could return fire. It was a style of fighting that the army had never encountered before. It was guerrilla warfare at its most effective, executed by men who had been training for this their entire lives without ever knowing it. On the southern approach, another group of Modoc warriors held their ground against the second column of soldiers. These warriors were led by a man called Hooker Jim, whose reputation for ferocity was well known on both sides of the conflict. Hooker Jim had his own reasons for fighting with such intensity. In the days following the Battle of Lost River, a group of settlers had attacked a peaceful Modoc camp on the other side of the lake, killing women and children who had nothing to do with the fighting. Hooker Jim had survived that attack, and the memory of it burned inside him like a coal that would never cool. He fought not just for survival but for justice, and his warriors matched his fury. The battle raged throughout the morning. The fog that had rolled in from Tool Lake added another layer of confusion to an already chaotic situation. Visibility dropped to almost nothing in some areas, reducing the soldiers to firing at sounds rather than targets. The Modoc, who knew every rock and path by memory, were unaffected by the fog. They used it as cover, moving silently through the mist to take up new positions, appearing like ghosts to fire a volley and then vanishing before the soldiers could react. By midday, the situation had become desperate for the army. Both columns had stalled. Casualties were mounting. The wounded lay scattered across the lava beds, their cries echoing off the rocks in every direction. Medics could not reach many of them because the terrain was too exposed to Modoc fire. Officers sent frantic messages back to the command post asking for reinforcements, for more ammunition, for some kind of strategy that could turn the tide. But there was no strategy that could overcome the fundamental reality of the situation. The Modoc held the high ground, they knew the terrain, and they were fighting for their lives. In the late afternoon, Wheaton ordered a retreat. The bugle call sounded across the lava beds, and the soldiers began pulling back, dragging their wounded with them. The Modoc did not pursue. They held their positions and watched the blue-coated soldiers stumble back across the open ground, leaving behind a trail of blood and abandoned equipment. When the last soldier had disappeared from view, a sound rose from inside the stronghold. It was not a war cry or a shout of triumph. It was something quieter, something deeper. It was the sound of relief mixed with defiance, the collective exhale of people who had faced annihilation and refused to be annihilated. The numbers told a story that the army did not want the public to hear. The soldiers had suffered over 40 casualties, with several dead and dozens wounded. The Modoc had not lost a single warrior. Not one. 52 men had held off over 400 soldiers and sent them running without suffering a single death among their fighters. It was one of the most lopsided victories in the history of the American Indian Wars, and it sent shockwaves through the military establishment and the national press. Inside the stronghold that night, the mood was cautious but alive with a quiet energy. Fires were lit in the deeper caves. Food was shared. The children who had spent the day huddled in the darkest parts of the cave system were brought out and fed. The young man who had pleaded with the hunter the night before found his sister sitting near one of the fires, her face dirty but unharmed, her eyes wide with the kind of awareness that comes to children who have witnessed things that no child should ever see. He sat down beside her and put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him without saying a word. The hunter was nearby, cleaning his rifle with steady hands, his face showing no more emotion than it had shown before the battle. He had kept his promise. The soldiers had not reached them, and as far as he was concerned, they never would. But Kinposh knew that the victory was temporary. He sat apart from the celebrations, staring into the darkness beyond the firelight, his mind working through the possibilities. He knew the army would come back. They always came back. And next time, they would bring more men, more guns, more determination. The government could not afford to let a small band of Modoc warriors humiliate the United States Army. It would send a message to every other tribe on every other reservation that resistance was possible, that the army could be beaten, that the land could be taken back. The government would do whatever it took to crush the Modoc, not just because of the land or the settlers, but because of what a Modoc victory represented. It represented hope. And hope, in the eyes of those who held power, was the most dangerous thing in the world. The weeks that followed the first battle were filled with tension and negotiation. The government, embarrassed by the defeat, sent peace commissioners to negotiate with Kinposh. They wanted to avoid another costly military assault if possible. Kinposh agreed to meet with them, not because he trusted them, but because he genuinely wanted peace. He had never wanted war. From the very beginning, all he had asked for was a small reservation for his people on their own land, near Tool Lake, where they could live according to their own ways without being subjected to the cruelty and indifference of the Klamath Reservation. It was a modest request, a reasonable request, a request that any fair-minded person would have considered legitimate. The peace talks took place in a tent set up on neutral ground between the stronghold and the army camp. General Edward Canby, the highest-ranking military officer in the region, led the government delegation. Canby was a respected figure, a veteran of the Civil War who had a reputation for integrity, but even Canby was constrained by the policies and priorities of a government that had no intention of giving the Modoc what they wanted. The government's position was clear. The Modoc must return to the Klamath Reservation. There would be no separate reservation near Tool Lake. There would be no compromise. Kinposh argued his case with eloquence and passion. He spoke of his people's suffering on the Klamath Reservation. He spoke of the broken promises, the stolen food, the daily humiliations. He asked why the government could not spare a small piece of land for a small group of people who wanted nothing more than to live in peace. His words were powerful and sincere, and some of the commissioners were genuinely moved. But the answer was always the same: no. Meanwhile, tensions within the Modoc band were rising. Some of the younger warriors, particularly Hooker Jim and a man called Curly-Headed Doctor, were losing patience with the negotiations. They argued that talking was useless, that the government would never keep its promises, that the only language the white man understood was violence. They pressured Kinposh to take a harder line. to use the peace talks as an opportunity to strike a blow that would force the government to take them seriously. Kintpuash resisted. He knew that killing the peace commissioners would bring disaster upon his people. But the pressure continued, growing more intense with each failed round of negotiations. The situation inside the stronghold was deteriorating as well. Food supplies were running low. The winter cold was relentless. Some of the children were getting sick. The women worked constantly to keep everyone fed and warm, but the resources were simply not enough. Every day that passed without a resolution brought the Modoc closer to a crisis that no amount of courage could overcome. Starvation does not care about bravery. Cold does not respect defiance. The basic needs of the human body eventually override everything else, and Kintpuash could see the clock ticking. The hunter who had made the promise continued to do what he had always done. He went out at night, slipping through the lava formations like a shadow, hunting for whatever game he could find in the sparse and frozen landscape. Sometimes he returned with a rabbit or a bird. Sometimes he returned with nothing. But he always returned. And every time he came back, he checked on the young girl he had sworn to protect. She had grown thinner, like everyone else. But there was a strength in her eyes that reminded him of the wild horses that ran across the high plateau, thin and wind-beaten but unbroken. He would give her whatever food he had, and she would look at him with those eyes, and he would nod once, and that was their entire conversation. Words were not necessary between them. The promise was the conversation, and it continued every day simply by the fact that she was still alive and still safe. By late March, the government had appointed a new military commander to deal with the Modoc situation. Brigadier General Alvin Gillam arrived with fresh troops and a mandate to end the standoff one way or another. Gillam was more cautious than Wheaton. He studied the terrain carefully, consulted with scouts, and developed a plan that was more methodical than the frontal assault that had failed so spectacularly in January. He also increased the pressure on the peace commissioners to reach a settlement, knowing that a diplomatic solution would be preferable to another bloody battle in the lava beds. The final round of peace talks was scheduled for April 11, 1873. Kintpuash had been pushed to the breaking point. The younger warriors had taunted him openly, calling him a coward for refusing to fight, questioning his leadership, threatening to choose a new chief if he did not act. In Modoc culture, a leader who lost the confidence of his warriors was finished. Kintpuash faced an impossible choice. If he continued to pursue peace, he would lose his authority, and his people would fracture into competing factions that the army could pick off one by one. If he gave in to the pressure and attacked the commissioners, he would bring the full fury of the United States government down upon them all. The night before the meeting, Kintpuash sat alone in the darkness of the lava beds. The stars above were hard and bright, like chips of ice scattered across a black cloth. He could hear the wind moving through the rocks, making sounds that could have been voices if a man was desperate enough to listen. He thought about his father, who had been a leader before him. He thought about the land, the lake, the mountains that had sheltered his ancestors for thousands of years. He thought about the children sleeping in the caves, the women who had not complained once despite the hunger and the cold, the warriors who trusted him to lead them through this darkness. And he thought about the meeting tomorrow, and the terrible thing he had been pressured into agreeing to do. The decision that Kintpuash made that night would change the course of the Modoc War and seal the fate of his people. It was a decision born not from hatred but from desperation, not from strength but from the crushing weight of impossible circumstances. And when the sun rose on April 11th, the world that the Modoc had fought so hard to preserve would begin its final, devastating collapse. Inside the caves, the young girl slept with her head resting on her brother's arm. The hunter sat nearby, his rifle across his knees, his eyes open, watching the entrance to the cave as he had watched it every night since the war began. Outside, the wind howled through the lava beds, carrying with it the smell of cold rock and distant water, and something else. Something that had no name but that every living creature recognized. It was the smell of an ending, and it was getting closer with every breath. April 11th, 1873, began like any other morning in the high desert. The sun climbed slowly above the eastern ridgeline, spilling pale gold light across the flat ground between the army camp and the lava beds. Birds moved in the distance. The air was still and dry, carrying the faint scent of sagebrush and dust. It was the kind of morning that, in another time and another place, might have been considered beautiful. But on this morning, beauty was the last thing on anyone's mind. The peace tent stood in the open ground, a small white structure that looked fragile and out of place against the harsh volcanic landscape. Inside that tent, two worlds were about to collide in a way that neither side could undo. General Edward Canby arrived with his delegation shortly before noon. He was accompanied by Reverend Eleazar Thomas, a Methodist minister who had volunteered to serve as a peace commissioner, and Alfred Meacham, a former superintendent of Indian Affairs who had long advocated for better treatment of native peoples. They came unarmed, as had been agreed. They came in good faith, believing that this meeting might finally produce the breakthrough that would end the standoff. Canby, despite his military background, was a man who preferred peace to war. He had told his aides that he believed Kintpash was a reasonable man who could be persuaded to accept a compromise. He was wrong, not about Kintpash's character, but about what desperation could do to even the most reasonable of men. Kintpash arrived with several of his warriors, including Hooker Jim, Shonchin John, Boston Charlie, and others who had been pushing for violence. The atmosphere in the tent was tense from the first moment. The men sat across from each other on the ground, and the conversation began the way it always did, with formal words and careful phrases that danced around the central issue without ever touching it directly. Canby stated the government's position. The Modoc must relocate. A reservation would be provided, but it would not be at Tule Kint. Pwash listened with a face that revealed nothing. Then he made one final attempt. He asked Canby, directly and simply, for a reservation on the Lost River near Tule Lake. He described the land, the water, the fishing spots where his people had fed themselves for generations. He spoke quietly, without anger, without threats, laying out his case as though he were presenting evidence in a court of law. He explained that his people had tried living on the Klamath Reservation and had been treated like animals. He explained that all they wanted was their own small piece of land where they could govern themselves and live according to their traditions. His voice was steady, that those who knew him could hear the strain beneath the surface. This was his last card. If this did not work, there was nothing left to play. Canby shook his head. The answer was no. Something shifted in that tent in that moment. The air itself seemed to change, growing heavier, thicker, as though the oxygen was being slowly pulled out of the space. Kintpash reached beneath his coat. The warriors around him moved at the same instant, as though they had rehearsed it, though in truth they had not rehearsed anything. There had been no plan. Only pressure and desperation and the terrible momentum of events that had been building for months. Kintpash drew a pistol and shot General Canby in the face. The sound of the gunshot was enormous in the small tent, shattering the silence like a rock thrown through glass. Canby fell backward, mortally wounded. In the chaos that followed, Boston Charlie shot Reverend Thomas, killing him. Shonchin John attacked Meacham, shooting him and slashing at him with a knife. Meacham survived, barely, saved by a Modoc woman named Winema, who threw herself over his body and screamed at the warriors to stop. The other commissioners fled, stumbling across the open ground toward the army camp with bullets striking the dirt around their feet. The killing of General Canby was a turning point not just in the Modoc War, but in the entire history of the American frontier. Canby was the only general officer of the United States Army to be killed during the Indian Wars. The news spread across the country like wildfire. Newspapers printed the story in huge headlines. Politicians demanded blood. The public, which had shown some sympathy for the Modoc cause after the first battle of the Stronghold, turned against them with the furious speed that only shock and outrage can produce. What had been seen as a courageous stand by a small group of people fighting for their homeland was now reframed as treachery and murder. The narrative changed overnight, and with it, the fate of the Modoc people was sealed. The military response was swift and overwhelming. Reinforcements poured into the region from every direction. The army now had over 1,000 soldiers assembled around the lava beds, supported by artillery, cavalry, and Indian scouts from rival tribes. General Jefferson C. Davis, no relation to the Confederate president, was given command of the operation with explicit orders to crush the Modoc resistance by any means necessary. There would be no more peace talks. There would be no more negotiations. There would be only force. Inside the stronghold, the mood had shifted from defiance to dread. The warriors knew what was coming. They had won the first battle, but they could not win a war of attrition against an enemy with unlimited resources. Food was nearly gone. Ammunition was running dangerously low. Some of the warriors had only a handful of bullets left. The women and children were suffering badly, weakened by weeks of hunger and exposure. The unity that had held the Modoc together through the winter was beginning to crack under the weight of exhaustion and fear. Kinposh himself seemed changed after the killing of Canby. The fire that had driven him through months of resistance had dimmed, replaced by something heavier and darker. He had never wanted to kill the general. He had been pushed into it by warriors whose rage had overwhelmed their judgment, and by circumstances that had left him no room to maneuver. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that the killing had destroyed whatever chance the Modoc had of achieving a peaceful resolution. He had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, and the consequences would be terrible. The Second Battle of the Stronghold began on April 15, 1873, 4 days after the killing of Canby. This time the army was better prepared. Gillam had studied the terrain more carefully and had positioned his troops to attack from multiple directions simultaneously. The artillery bombardment was more sustained and more accurate than the first time, targeting the specific areas of the lava beds where the Modoc were known to be concentrated. Under cover of the shelling, infantry units moved forward in smaller, more flexible groups rather than the rigid formations that had failed so disastrously in January. The Modoc fought back with everything they had, but the mathematics of war were working against them. Every bullet they fired was a bullet they could not replace. Every warrior who was wounded reduced their fighting strength in a way that could not be recovered. The army, by contrast, had a steady supply of fresh troops, ammunition, food, and medical care flowing in from the rear. They could afford to be patient, to grind the Modoc down slowly, to chip away at the defenses day by day until there was nothing left. The hunter who had promised to protect the young girl fought in the forward positions during the heaviest attacks. He fired carefully, making every bullet count, aiming with the precision of a man who had been shooting since he could hold a rifle. Between attacks, he went back to the cave to check on the girl and her brother. The brother was now fighting alongside the other warriors, his earlier fear replaced by a grim determination that aged him beyond his years. The girl had taken on responsibilities of her own, helping the women care for the wounded, carrying water to the fighters, tending the small fires that kept the children warm. She moved through the caves with a quiet efficiency that earned the respect of the older women, who saw in her the same strength that had sustained Modoc women for generations. The battle lasted several days, with intermittent fighting broken by periods of eerie silence. The army gradually tightened its grip around the stronghold, cutting off access to water sources and food supplies. On the night of April 17th, Kinpuash made the decision to abandon the stronghold. It was the hardest decision of his life, harder even than the decision to kill Canby. The stronghold had been their fortress, their symbol of resistance, the place where they had achieved the impossible. Leaving it felt like leaving a part of themselves behind. The Modoc slipped out of the stronghold under cover of darkness, moving south through the lava beds in a long, silent column. The women carried the children. The warriors carried the wounded. They left nothing behind that could be of use to the enemy. When the soldiers entered the stronghold the next morning, they found empty caves and cold fire pits, and the echoes of a people who had vanished like smoke. What followed was a running battle that lasted for weeks. The Modoc moved through the lava beds in the surrounding wilderness, fighting rearguard actions, setting ambushes, using every trick and tactic they knew to slow the pursuing army. But the net was closing. The soldiers had Indian scouts who could track the Modoc through terrain that would have been impossible for white troops to navigate alone. The Modoc band began to splinter. Groups broke off, some trying to escape on their own, others surrendering to the army in exchange for promises of leniency. Hooker Jim, the warrior who had been most vocal in pushing for the killing of Canby, was among those who surrendered. In a bitter twist that revealed the true nature of the forces at work, Hooker Jim agreed to help the army track down Kinposh in exchange for amnesty. The man who had pressured his chief into an act of violence was now betraying him to save his own skin. It was a betrayal that cut deeper than any wound the army could inflict, and it shattered whatever remained of the Modoc's collective spirit. Kinposh was finally captured on June 1, 1873, in a remote area of the lava beds. He was exhausted, starving, and accompanied by only a handful of followers. When the soldiers found him, he did not resist. He looked at them with eyes that held neither fear nor defiance, only the profound weariness of a man who had fought as hard as any human being could fight and had finally reached the end of his strength. He said, according to the accounts that survived, "My legs have given out." It was a simple statement, but it carried the weight of everything he had endured and everything he had lost. The trial of Kinposh and 5 other Modoc leaders was held at Fort Klamath in July 1873. It was a military tribunal, not a civilian court. and the outcome was never in doubt. The defendants were charged with murder and assault in connection with the killing of the peace commissioners. They were not permitted to have proper legal representation. The proceedings were conducted in English, a language that most of the defendants did not fully understand. The tribunal found all 6 men guilty. 4 of them, including Kinpash, were sentenced to death by hanging. The other 2 had their sentences commuted to life imprisonment on Alcatraz Island. On October 3, 1873, Kinpash was hanged at Fort Klamath before a crowd of spectators that included soldiers, settlers, and members of the Klamath tribe. He walked to the gallows with a steady step and showed no visible emotion. Before the hood was placed over his head, he spoke his final words. Different accounts give slightly different versions of what he said, but the essence was the same. He said that he was not afraid to die. He said that he had done what he believed was right for his people. He said that the land would remember them even if the world forgot. After the execution, the United States government did something that revealed the depth of its cruelty. The remaining Modoc people, those who had survived the war and the surrender, were forcibly relocated to Indian Territory in present-day Oklahoma, over 1,500 miles from their homeland. They were loaded onto wagons and trains and shipped across the country like cargo, deposited in a strange land with a strange climate, where nothing looked or felt or smelled like home. The government even went further, sending Kinpash's severed head to the Army Medical Museum in Washington for study, a final act of desecration that stripped the fallen leader of dignity even in death. The Modoc people endured. They had no choice. They endured the heat of Oklahoma, which was nothing like the cold, high desert they had known. They endured diseases that swept through their weakened community. They endured poverty and neglect and the systematic erosion of their culture and language. But they did not disappear. They held on to their stories, their traditions, their identity, passing them down from one generation to the next like seeds carried in cupped hands through a storm. The young girl who had been hidden in the caves of the lava beds grew up in Oklahoma. She carried the memory of the war inside her like a stone lodged in her chest, heavy and permanent. She remembered the sound of the shells exploding against the rocks. She remembered the smell of gunpowder and blood. She remembered the face of the hunter who had promised her brother that the soldiers would not reach them. And she remembered the way he had kept that promise through the darkest days of the siege. She told her children about him, and her children told their children. And the story traveled through time, gaining weight and meaning with each retelling, until it became something more than a memory. It became a testament. Her brother survived the war as well. He carried scars on his body and deeper ones inside his mind, the kind that never fully heal but that become part of who a person is. He lived a quiet life in Oklahoma, working the land that was given to him, raising a family, trying to build something out of the wreckage of everything that had been taken. He never spoke much about the war, but on certain nights when the wind blew in a particular way, he would sit outside and stare at the stars, and his wife would see something in his eyes that she knew better than to ask about. The past was always there, just beneath the surface, like water running underground. The hunter's fate is less certain. Some accounts suggest he was among those killed in the final weeks of the war, cut down in one of the many skirmishes that marked the Modoc's desperate retreat through the lava beds. Other accounts suggest he survived and was among those sent to Oklahoma, where he lived out his remaining years in silence, his promise fulfilled, his purpose completed. What is certain is that his words survived. They won't reach you. 4 words spoken in a cave on a cold night, carrying within them everything that the Modoc people were and everything they refused to stop being. In 1978, the United States government finally allowed the descendants of the exiled Modoc to return to Oregon. Some came back, others stayed in Oklahoma, where they had built lives and communities over the course of a century. The Modoc people today are divided between the Klamath tribes in Oregon and the Modoc Nation in Oklahoma, 2 branches of the same tree, separated by geography but connected by blood and memory and the stubborn refusal to be erased. The lava beds still stand. They are a national monument now, preserved by the same government that once sent 1,000 soldiers to destroy the people who lived there. Visitors can walk through the stronghold where Kinpash and his warriors held off the army. They can stand in the caves where the women and children sheltered during the bombardment. They can look out across the same landscape that the Modoc warriors watched from behind their rock walls, scanning the flat ground for the approach of soldiers who wanted to end their existence. The rocks have not changed. The wind still moves through them in the same way, making the same sounds, carrying the same cold. If you stand in the right spot at the right time of day, you can almost hear it. The echo of voices that have been silent for over 150 years, but that have never truly stopped speaking. And somewhere in that echo, if you listen carefully enough, you can hear a young man's voice cracking with fear and love, saying the only thing that mattered. Hide, my sister, if they come. And you can hear the calm, unshakable reply of a man who had already decided that failure was not an option. They won't reach you. That promise was kept. Not just for one night or one battle or one war. It was kept through generations of exile, through decades of silence, through all the years when it seemed like the world had forgotten that the Modoc ever existed. The promise was kept by everyone who remembered the story and told it to someone else. The promise was kept by every Modoc child who grew up knowing where they came from and what their ancestors had endured. The promise was kept by the land itself, which held the memory of those people in its rocks and its water and its wind, waiting patiently for someone to come back and listen. Some promises are made with words and broken with excuses. Others are made with the whole soul and kept with the whole life. The hunter's promise was the second kind, and that is why, after all these years, after everything that was lost and everything that was taken and everything that was endured, the story still lives. Because some things are stronger than armies. Some things are stronger than governments. Some things are stronger than time itself. And a promise made in the darkness of a cave by a man who would not let fear touch the people he had sworn to protect is one of those things. The Modoc are still here. They are still telling their stories. They are still keeping their promises. And the lava beds are still standing, silent and ancient and patient, holding within their stone hearts the memory of a war that was fought not for territory or treasure, but for the simplest and most powerful thing in the world: the right to exist, the right to belong, the right to say, this is our land, this is our home, and we will not leave it without a fight. And they did fight. They fought harder and longer and more courageously than anyone had a right to expect. And even though they lost the war, they won something that no army could ever take away from them. They won the story. And the story, as it always does, outlasted everything else.